psychology. Okay, moving forward, we have what's known as behaviorism, but under the behaviorism tenet, we have Ivan Pavlov, who is credited with and often associated with, for pun intended, I guess there, classical conditioning. So everybody has at least probably at one point heard of Pavlov's dogs. But before we get into all of that, I throughout this course am going to say the word stimulus very often, okay? So a stimulus is literally anything, person, place, or thing that elicits a response in an organism, okay? And so, under classical conditioning with Ivan Pavlov, he was able to train a dog to salivate to the ringing of a bell. Well, how do you do that overall? This is something that we're going to get a little bit more into depth whenever we get into Chapter 6, learning. But we as humans, as you'll learn, and animals in general, are really good association machines. We're not as great memory machines, okay, but we are really good at associating two or more stimuli together. That's why whenever you're studying and you create an acronym for a particular long form either paragraph or terminology that you have to learn for your science classes, when you break it down into like PEMDAS or whatever the case is, it's a lot easier to remember that stuff because we're strong association machines, right? And so classical conditioning goes a little bit more into depth. Classical conditioning is quite simply learning from association, like we already do, but it helps us to anticipate events, right? So in general, we're training our reflexes. Food naturally causes a reflex within us. So whenever we see, especially when we're hungry, we see or smell our favorite food, we may begin to salivate similar to a dog, right? And before we condition or pair the two stimuli, the food with a bell, the bell that has no response and especially doesn't cause you to salivate, right? It may get your attention briefly, but it's not going to cause any sort of reflex or natural reflex that you're born with, okay? Now, what we'll do whenever we are training you to associate something to anticipate an event, we will ring a bell, and right after that or simultaneously, we will have the food present. And of course, a dog is really good at learning this as well, as you've probably done this either intentionally or unintentionally over time, and pretty quickly you're going to learn to associate, and that dog is going to learn to associate that the bell equals food is about to arrive. So the bell will elicit a reflex, but it's not a natural reflex now, it's a conditioned reflex, okay? So that's classical conditioning in a nutshell. All I really want you to take away from this particular slide today is that a stimulus equals anything, person, place, or thing that elicits a response. So that is like food, water, candy, whatever the case. Any person, place, or thing that elicits a response in you. As well, classical conditioning, thanks to Ivan Pavlov, is the understanding that we learn from association to anticipate events. Classical conditioning. Now, the overall umbrella that this is underneath, classical conditioning as well as operant conditioning, is known as behaviorism. Now, with behaviorism, you can thank John B. Watson for being the father of this very school of thought. And so Watson was a big proponent for, hey, listen, guys, objective analysis of the mind is impossible. It's an unobservable entity that you're looking after here. Let's try and focus on something that we can actually study and measure and come to conclusions on. So he introduced the concept of behavior as an objective in which we should look into. Okay, and so Watson, he was an American psychologist who he started at. He was a professor at Johns Hopkins University, but then he turned into a marketer. And this is something that I tell my students consistently, especially if you're going into business, marketing, etc. If you really want to be successful, and John Watson's a great example of this, having a decent understanding or maybe even minoring in psychology is a decent idea, because you're going to need to learn about people in business. how to motivate them to buy, what motivates them to buy, to sell, what keeps their attention, what doesn't keep their attention. Always trying to keep your finger on the pulse of understanding human behavior in general. So because Watson has a good understanding of psychology, he took his understanding of this and went into business and was wildly successful. So professor turned marketer, and you can thank him, especially here in the United States, for the term of the coffee break. Okay, so here, even till this day, decades, almost centuries later, we still use what's known as coffee break, and here in the United States, and that's because of Watson. And another thing that Watson thought of was that he thought that every baby is born with a blank slate. It's strictly, again, behaviorism is the idea that you are trained through your environment. It's, they discount genetics very heavily, behaviorists do. And it's all about, hey, I can train through environmental experience. I can train this baby into being whatever I want it to be, a doctor, lawyer, or shoot, even serial killer, I guess you could say. But the thing that Watson is most known for as far as his experiment is the little Albert experiment, which is something that we'll dive into a little bit later, but whenever we get into later chapters. But the little Albert experiment was something that, again, showed classical conditioning, which is based on Edward Thorndike's law of effect that states we're more likely to engage in a behavior if it yields a pleasant consequence and less likely to engage in a behavior if it yields an unpleasant or neutral consequence. And so he used association to make little Albert, unfortunately, it was a very unethical experience, but unfortunately made little Albert fearful of white fluffy things in general. And so we'll kind of get to that down the road when we get to chapter 6. All right, operant conditioning. This is thanks to B.F. Skinner. So operant conditioning is learning from our consequences. So we have things such as positive and negative, reinforcement and punishment, which we'll dive into even more down the way. But B.F. Skinner you can thank for operant conditioning. He really concentrated on how behavior is affected by its consequences and how it can be modified through reinforcement and punishment. And you are going to have a really good understanding of this down the road.